to this computer. Welcome and thank you for joining us for the Human Dimensions workshop here. We're really excited to get this one going. I will just mention again that there's a chat. You can put some questions, any comments in. We also have the Q&A box. We'll leave the questions to the end for the speakers. So if you could just throw them in there and we'll answer them at the end of the webinar. Any technical difficulties too, you can throw in the chat and I'll try to help you guys out. But for now, my name is Paige. I've worked with the Alberta Invasive Species Council for almost 4 years now. And our job at the council is to educate individuals about invasive species, how to prevent their introduction, stop the spread in and around the province. We work really closely with provincial invasive species managers all the time. You can see Hannah McKenzie and Nicole Kimmel on our panel here. They are some of these managers, and in discussions with them, we've identified that the human dimensions aspect of invasive species needs to be explored, and we need to better address this. So we got in contact with the professional, Dr. Howie Harshaw, who specializes in this field. So today we'll hear about the concepts of human dimensions and how it relates to the management of wildlife, how it can inform our understandings and management of human-wildlife interactions, and ways that incorporating people's perspectives may help achieve those invasive species management goals. So I'd just like to start out a little bit with Nicole, who is the Provincial Aquatic Invasive Specialist with Alberta Environment and Protected Areas. And then we'll hear from Hannah, who is the Wild Boar Program Specialist with Alberta Agriculture and Irrigation. They're just going to touch base on how human dimensions impacts the management of invasive species like goldfish and wildlife, which they deal with on the regular there.
Okay. I just wanted to touch base on the aquatic invasive species side. So aquatic invasive species challenges often stem from human activities, whether through releases, unintentional transport on watercraft and equipment, or the spread of species for pet, garden, and food purposes. So people are a large part of the problem, yet people also hold the power to prevent, manage, and respond to these ongoing threats through informed actions like clean, drain, dry, responsible best management practices, and an active commitment to environmental stewardship. Each of us can help protect Alberta waters and natural ecosystems from the dangers of aquatic invasive species. So we might be part of the problem, but we're also part of the solution as well. So looking forward to what Dr. Harshaw has to say with us today. So thanks.
Hannah?
Sure, yeah, thanks, Paige. And similar thoughts to Nicole. I think as managers of different systems, we tend to think of ourselves as kind of outside the system, or we focus really on the species and wildlife and plants and things that make up the system. And we sometimes forget that humans are integral parts of those systems. And so I think I'm really looking forward to Dr. Harshaw's webinar. And I think that it would give anyone who's in a position of managing or working or protecting any of our natural systems some new perspectives and understanding coming at it from the considering the human dimension not as an afterthought but as a kind of integral part of the whole problem. So I'm looking forward to Howie's webinar today.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. And now we'll get Howie to take it away. Dr. Harshaw is a professor in the Faculty of Kinesiology, Sport and Recreation at the U of A, University of Alberta. Sorry, he has degrees from Lakeland University and received his PhD from the University of British Columbia. So Howie integrates social science into the planning and management of wildlife and natural resources, and has worked regularly in interdisciplinary teams to provide theoretical-based research contributions to broader landscape-based projects examining sustainability and conservation issues.
Thanks very much, Paige, and thanks everyone for joining us today. It's a real privilege to be here, and gosh, there's a great number of you. I'm really excited to dig into this with you all. So just really quickly, I'll say right from the outgo that I don't really have a lot of experience with invasive species management. And, working with Paige and Hannah and Nicole, it's really helped me better appreciate some of this work. I have done a little bit of work with some colleagues here at U of A around Prussian carp. So I do have some ideas about this, but I think my expertise is really in understanding how we can better integrate and incorporate people's perspectives into the management of wildlife, their habitats, and that certainly includes invasive species. So what I thought I'd do today is to give you sort of a broad overview of the Human Dimensions approach, what it is and what it isn't. Think about how it might relate to invasive species work, particularly the management and trying to change people's behavior so that they're not accidentally or deliberately aiding the spread of invasive species. And then thinking about just some, I guess, applied social science perspectives and methods that we can use to better understand the particular context that we're working in and the particular people that we're working with. So, yeah, thanks for joining today. And I guess we'll have questions at the end today. So I'll just start off quickly. Aldo Leopold, one of those deep thinkers we have in conservation. Kind of got me started as well. And one of his quotes that's really resonated with me is that there are two things that interest me: the relation of people to each other and the relation of people to the land. And I really do think that these experiences we do have in nature not only help us to understand, I think, those natural spaces a little bit better, but they also serve as places that bring people together. And I think that strengthens communities, strengthens families, and just sort of strengthens the different relationships that we have with one another. As Paige was mentioning, I'm in the Faculty of Kinesiology, Sport and Recreation, and some of you might be wondering, what the heck can he tell us um, about invasive species management? And I guess that this place where I am, I think it's pretty important, actually. Not everyone has the opportunity to work outdoors, to work in natural settings. And often we have the opportunities to visit those places through the leisure that we do, through the outdoor recreation activities that we engage in. And a lot of the work that I do is really focused on understanding the relationships that people have with these natural spaces and how those relationships help them to better understand um, sort of the complexity of these places, perhaps their roles in it, perhaps helping them to understand what their impacts are, but also looking to see how these natural experiences might have impacts on other aspects of their lives, sort of in the other domains when they're not in natural areas. How sticky, I suppose, are some of the learnings that they've had, some of the impressions they've gotten from nature. So that's really what I'm curious about, and I think Aldo Leopold situates that quite nicely for me. Although we have a lot of opportunities to engage in outdoor recreation activities, and certainly Alberta is a great place to be for that, a lot of folks have suggested that we're kind of disconnected from nature. And this disconnect from nature has some impacts in terms of what we think about nature, how we ultimately manage it. And when we think about managing nature, I'm thinking about habitat, wildlife, those particular pieces. They're often on public lands, crown lands, and they're to be managed for, I guess, the benefit, the use of all Canadians. But we have to be thinking about doing things differently. We need to be thinking about longer time scales, for example. And this disconnect from nature can have a negative impact on how we plan and how we manage these places. Rick Searle in 2000 wrote a book, Phantom Parks, and was did a nice sort of investigation of the state of Canada's parks at that time. And he concluded that humans seem to have gained a high degree of independence from the natural world. Humanity appears to have very nearly lost a deep sense of connectedness to nature. Uh, about a decade later, Ken Salazar, who was the U.S. Secretary of the Interior, observed that the biggest single threat to conservation in America is the growing disconnect of our people with the outdoors. And these two quotes really resonate with me. I do think that this disconnect we have makes our understanding of natural areas not as deep as it could be. We tend to focus on beautiful landscapes like we might see from a canoe, but we don't often think about what's going on beneath those trees, in the soils, for example, and indeed in the lakes, and the impacts that we can have by either deliberately or accidentally helping to move invasive species. I think this is one area that is a real conservation issue that we need to be paying attention to. And given that you're here today, I know that many of you are. And certainly when we think about conservation, it's not just about those particular places or those particular species that we're concerned with. It's us too. It's people and the roles that we play both as part of these systems, but the impacts that we can have either intentionally or otherwise on wildlife and their habitats, but also the benefits that we get from wildlife and their habitats. And often we these days, I guess we about these a lot as ecosystem services, um, cultural services, regulatory services, those kinds of things. But certainly we do benefit a lot from these natural ecosystem services. And to a degree, how can we still have these, intact systems persist into the future and be able to continue to provide these benefits that we really depend on? So I come to this from a human dimensions perspective. And human dimensions, I guess, is a relatively recent um, sort of approach, recent being the last sort of 40, 50 years. Um, and really what we can think about human dimensions is an applied social science. It's also really interdisciplinary. And really what we try to do with human dimensions is understand why humans value natural resources, how we want particular resources managed, and how we affect or are affected by the natural resource decisions. Now, we also have to understand there's going to be a diversity of ideas about how this ought to be done. And by no means am I suggesting that we should be managing invasive species or any other element of these natural systems by public opinion. We definitely have to be focused on people with expertise in these areas, biologists, ecologists of different stripes, but also social scientists. And this includes folks like me, but I think it also includes people concerned with governance, with regulatory systems, planning and management as well. But recognizing too that, people are part of these systems and try to influence how people are thinking about these things can help us to realize some of these conservation ideas, some of these conservation approaches that we're trying to test out and implement on the landscapes. I guess human dimensions also tries to understand human traits and how we can incorporate this understanding into planning and management actions. I come from a perspective that suggests that, well, it might be really challenging to actually manage these natural systems. I'd suggest that we don't understand them as fully as we could. But we can influence people, and we might be able to manage people better than we're able to manage natural areas. And I'm not trying to cast aspersions to anybody, but I guess we could argue too, there's lots about people we don't understand. But I think we might have a leg up with folks in trying to understand how we might influence their behaviors, perhaps change some of their attitudes, and help inform their beliefs. Certainly, as I mentioned before, human dimensions is a multi or interdisciplinary approach, and it covers a variety of ideas and practices, including cultural, social, and economic values, individual as well as sort of group or social behavior. We think about things like demographics and how those might be influencing large groups of people in terms of their responses to nature, but we also recognize the importance of legal institutional frameworks of management, the importance of communication and education, and also a recognition of the importance of the decision-making process as well. So when we think about this applied social science approach, how are we doing this? What sorts of disciplines and fields are we engaging with? And this isn't a complete list by any stretch, but I think it does include the sort of larger domains of interdisciplinary studies, things like epidemiology, regional and urban planning, policy studies, of course. We also have to think about this communications piece. How are we getting information to people about these critical issues that we're facing? How do we frame those issues? How do we get those issues in front of different people who might be able to take action, might be in positions to implement things on their own lands, perhaps? Or indeed, how do we influence people to support government regulations, government approaches that really are informed by other forms of science, natural science, for example, and get those sort of benefits, those long-term benefits that we're really looking to do? We'd also think about the role of the humanities as well, thinking about things like applied ethics, history, and philosophy. We can think about perhaps Aldo Leopold, certainly he was a natural scientist, but a bit of a philosopher as well. How do we craft arguments to understand our connections to nature? And thinking about history as well. What can we learn from things we haven't done well in the past, as well as things that we have done well in the past? What can be learned from our previous engagements with natural resource management. And I tend to find myself here at the bottom here in the social and behavioral sciences. I'm not sure why it's upside down. I'm certainly not. But these might be more of the sort of social science disciplines or approaches you might be more familiar with. Things like economics, geography, law, political science, psychology, sociology, and how these different disciplines and fields and their theoretical backgrounds, the different explanations that they're able to bring to the table can help us better understand not just the role of people in natural systems, but what those connections mean and how we might strengthen those connections, as well as try to shift people's behaviors so that they might be more in tune with the sort of outcomes that we'd like to see on a broader scale. So as I mentioned, I do a lot of my work understanding people's recreation activities, and I've been doing a lot of work recently with waterfowl hunters, bird watchers too, but trying to understand how people are connecting with, in this case, waterfowl, as well as their habitats, both wetlands and the adjacent and associated upland habitats as well. Critical places in Canada's prairies for sure. And when we think about this, we can also extend this, I think, to invasive species. But how do people value wildlife and invasive species? What do they think about them? Are they positive? Are they negative? Um, what importance do they place on these particular critters, if you like? Associated with that, how do people want wildlife and invasive species to be managed? Now, probably they're thinking of managing wildlife and endangered species, or sorry, invasive species somewhat differently, but understanding what people think might be the right approach, I think is an important step in thinking about management solutions. Um, what are people thinking? Do we have to change people's perspectives or minds about things, for example? Or are there ideas within the population already that we might be able to support and elevate? We also have to consider how people affect, as well as how they're affected by wildlife and invasive species management decisions. Um, Certainly, as Hannah and Nicole were saying earlier, people play really significant roles in distributing invasive species. How do we stop that? How do we limit that? Um, and how do we think about some of the impacts that invasive species have for people? Um, Certainly, we have growing urban populations, and we talked about this disconnect from nature earlier. Is that because we really have become disconnected and don't understand some of the implications of moving alien invasive species around particular areas, for example? What impact does that have for some of the commercial activities we're engaged with, like agriculture, fisheries, um, and other natural resource management that's really important for not just sort of local and regional economies, but provincial and national economies as well. And I guess lastly, we need to think about how we can best incorporate people's preferences into wildlife and invasive species management and planning. Um, we are managing these areas for people on behalf of Canadians in a sense. There's a wide variation among what people are thinking, doing, and feeling about wildlife, about invasive species. Some of those ideas can be really good and how we can maybe incorporate some of those, elevate some of those. But I think also we need to recognize we do need to try to change people's minds about things. And I'm not suggesting we're doing this as some kind of nefarious kind of activity. I think we have to be open and transparent about that. Here's some information, here's some outcomes. Some of these outcomes are negative ones. What can we do as communities, as regions, as Albertans, as Canadians, however we like to frame that? What can we do to better support these positive outcomes and recognize that this will often involve trade-offs? Um, to get some of those positive outcomes, we might have to change our own behaviors. That might have to do with consumption. It might have to do with the ways that we travel. It might have to do with the small things we do, like checking our boats, for example, for invasive species before we move them to new waterways. So lots of different things we need to be thinking about. I guess thinking about this role with human dimensions too, it's probably important if you haven't come across this term to think about, where are we coming from? What are some of those principles that kind of underlie the activities that we do and the knowledge that we try to seek and support? I guess the first principle would be that human and ecosystem interactions are natural and to varying degrees are dependent on one another. As both Paige and Hannah said, we really have roles as part of these systems. We have particular maybe planning and management roles that are going to be useful for having these places persist, these wildlife persist in time, as well as trying to have habitats that have integrity, that don't have a lot of invasive species in them, that can really disrupt sort of the natural order of things. Certainly, we also recognize that ecosystems are complex and they're managerially challenging. I do believe that it might be easier to try to change and manage people than it might be ecosystems. I'm happy to have that discussion and debate over coffee and tea. I'm always open to having my mind changed. But I think either way, we are trying to foster change, whether that's change in people and or change in ecosystems as well. I think we also recognize that the character and the complexity of ecosystems varies by both temporal and spatial scales, and certainly everything is connected. So how can we have an effect, very kind of precise effects on the kinds of outcomes we want without causing further disruptions in these systems? And we need to think about what are the spatial and temporal scales that we're concerned about, and those will probably vary by the kinds of invasive species we're looking to manage. Then lastly, sound responsible management is sort of a key human role in ecosystem sustainability. We have a good number of sort of characteristics that allow us, I suppose, to think critically, to think about things on longer time scales, to think about things in complex ways that perhaps other species can't. And one of the outcomes of that is we do have a role to try to manage ecosystems, manage people in ways that will help everything persist into the future. So now that we have a bit of a sense of what human dimensions approach is, just a really quick sort of a 101 on different ways that we might try to influence and understand people's perspectives about invasive species. So here we have the cognitive hierarchy, which comes from social psychology. It was really popularized in the mid-90s by David Fulton and its application to the management of wildlife in the United States, but it's really kind of taken up from there. So if we think about this, we might think about ourselves having, a particular set of values. And typically the values that we hold about things are very few in number. They could range, depending on who you've read, from 8 to 32, sort of core values that really help to frame and describe things that people deem to be really important, things that are really meaningful for them. And we look at this cognitive hierarchy, it is sort of an inverted pyramid, if you like. And although these values are sort of few, they're definitely core to these other elements of the hierarchy and really do have an influence in terms of what other elements are able to sort of express themselves. The thing about values too, not only are they few in number, but they're pretty resilient too. They're slow to change. Most of the values that we've adopted come to us early in life from family, from friends, from various institutions that we belong to or join, and they remain pretty central to our beliefs. I guess the other thing about understanding people's values, and here we're not talking about monetary values necessarily, it's about the importance, sort of that right or wrong, good and bad. They transcend situations and they help us and they prepare us to be able to react to different things. One level up, we have what we call sort of value orientation, sort of basic belief patterns. We might think of these as sort of non-scientific paradigms. How do people generally see the world? And these really are helpful in understanding and influencing this next level, attitudes and norms, which I think are pretty similar. We can think of attitudes as things held by individual folks like you and me. What do we think about particular things? How do we evaluate or assess particular situations? And what do we think about those situations? Are they beneficial for us? Is it a challenging area? Is it something we could be doing better? And we can also think of norms as a similar thing, but norms are typically held by groups. They could be communities, regions, provinces, nations, but generally this would be sort of group attitudes, if you like, they can have a real influence on individuals' attitudes. If we have sort of social norms, they kind of dictate to us what is the proper thing to do. And it can relate to things from as basic as driving on the right side of the road, to assisting people in need without needing to be asked, things like that. And they can depend on our communities and the people that are in them. Now, these will influence the ways that we choose to behave, the ways that we would like to be able to behave. We call those behavioral intentions. And it's sort of an in-between, I guess, between attitudes and behaviors. It's the things that we would like to be able to do, but sometimes context, sometimes the immediate situation in front of us doesn't allow us to actually follow up on those intentions. But the formation of those intentions is going to be pretty important to actually realizing the behaviors that we'd like to see. And I'll be returning to this a little bit later. But as we go up this hierarchy, we find that we have sort of more expressions of these different elements. We think about different ways that we can behave, different ways we can react to things. It really depends on the situation, and we're pretty savvy in terms of understanding and identifying sort of the correct behavior we ought to be doing in a particular situation. And that often comes from being informed through communication about these other things. I guess the other thing to say is that although behaviors are really obvious and apparent, we can actually see those, we can observe those, we really can't observe these other things. You might think of this as a bit of an iceberg. We can watch people's behaviors, but we don't always know what underlies them unless we really get out and ask them. So we need to think about those things too. Thinking about our connections in these systems, our place in these systems, a good number of folks have talked about social ecological systems. Eleanor Ostrom was among those and really did some critical work in helping us to understand the relationships of people to the natural world. And we think about our social ecological system, we are, in fact, we're part of nature. We're not separate from it. We didn't just beam down from outer space. We evolved on this planet with these different habitats, these different wildlife, these different critters, and we're just part of those systems. And as we've seen before, we're affected by what happens in this system, and I think we have an oversized effect too on these systems through human impacts, through the things that we do. So there has been a good deal of work in invasive species around human dimensions, but it's not as deep, I suppose, as a lot of the ecological work that's been done. To date, most of the research about invasive species has focused on those ecological aspects. And we tend to think about the environmental change and the management issues that are both driven by and also exacerbated by the things that people do in these natural systems. And we have to understand that thinking about things as a social ecological system might be a really important sort of step or communication that, we're a part of this. You don't want to be messing up your backyard because it's going to have impacts for you and your family. Let's think about our backyard in a bit more of a bigger scale, if you like. And as both Nicole and Hannah have identified at the beginning of this, people in society are fundamentally involved with biological invasions. We do this in multiple ways, either from that initial introduction of an invasive species to a system, to recognizing, gosh, we have a problem here, we need to fix it, and then ultimately trying to find management solutions to address that. And again, maybe that's trying to not only address what's happening in the ecological system, trying to get those critters out of there, for example, but thinking about how we might change people's actions and behaviors and the ways that they think about invasive species. This image came from the council's website. I just wanted to acknowledge that. In terms of the human dimensions work that's been done in and around invasive species, a lot of the work has focused on really identifying and understanding the roles of people as catalysts, drivers, and vectors for the introduction and spread of invasive species, whether that's deliberate or accidental, and trying to understand in particular situations how that's come to be, how has that happened. And I think there's pretty solid evidence that people are serving as vectors for these. So how can we then, now that we know these things, how can we start to alter, change, persuade people to change different behaviors that they have? Certainly, we also understand that people influence the susceptibility of ecosystems by modifying disturbance regimes, altering landscapes and the environment that might make them more amenable to alien species as well, things that haven't been there before. Certainly, climate change is really having a huge impact on the habitats and ranges of a lot of different wildlife. It's altering systems, and this is going to create additional vectors for invasive species as well. We need to think about those things. And then how do we layer that on to the impacts that invasive species can have on people's livelihoods as well as people's well-being? And I think these are areas around human dimensions of invasive species that we don't quite understand as well. I think there's definitely more work needed in these areas. This is some work from Shackleton and their co-authors, and what they're trying to do here is try to provide a nice summary. This was done in 2019, so it's not all that old, and try to sort of describe where things are at in a sense for invasive species, thinking about the human and the social dimensions of that. So we have some good information about people as the cause of these invasions, understanding that to a degree, different motivations that people have for making introductions. Gosh, this might be a nice species to look at. It might be a nice species to hunt and eat. Maybe we should have some of those around here. Thinking about different ways that we move through landscapes, both by vehicles like cars and boats, but also other things. We can carry different species in the soles of our boots if we're not careful. We have to be kind of cautious about things like that. Again, thinking about different modifications to ecosystems that might make those ecosystems less resilient to changes and might make them sort of better suited for invasion. So we have some good understandings of those things. So we should think too about, and we know a little bit more about people's connections and their perceptions of invasive species, sort of this understanding about where they're coming from. But we've also done a bit of work, well, others have, trying to understand the importance of how we frame these particular issues around invasive species. I know that there's been some discussions among the council about, well, what's the best ways that we can convey these ideas to the public? Do we come sort of top down, authoritative? This is what has to be done to solve the problem, or do we try and frame it a bit differently so individuals can see themselves in the issue and want to do something on their own, and we can maybe help coordinate some of those actions. But I think this comes down to understanding these sort of different elements of that cognitive hierarchy and how people are sort of thinking, feeling, and what they're doing in and around invasive species. What are their attitudes, their perceptions, their beliefs? What's the roles of different cultures in not only help influencing people's ideas, but perhaps influencing people's behaviors as well? What are some perhaps cultural practices that might be really important for particular communities, but might be providing vectors for invasive species as well? There's also been work done about understanding the effects of invasive species on people in terms of the effects of their livelihoods. You might see this in farming, you might see this among anglers or fishers in aquatic environments. But certainly thinking about perhaps the public more broadly and the ecosystem services that nature provides and how when those ecosystems become invaded, become a bit less resilient, perhaps. What implications does that have for some of those ecosystem services that we become quite dependent upon? We need thinking also about socioeconomic impacts. We talk about people's livelihoods. Invasive species can definitely affect things like productivity of particular landscapes, agricultural landscapes, forested landscapes, for example. How do we change that so that we don't see some of these ill effects and that we're better able to support not just these ecosystems, but the people who depend on them as well? I guess we also know a little bit about people's responses to invasions. There's been a lot of work with different stakeholders to understand how they're sort of feeling particular impacts. We might think about different conflict resolution ideas we might use to try and change people's behaviors, try to lower the sort of the heat of some of these conflicts, and really try to seek solutions through collaboration, and also thinking about the effects and opportunities for social learning. How can we help people understand these systems better? But I guess the challenge becomes, how do you navigate all the information that we see every day so that we get these issues in front of people? And I think part of this comes down to governance, how people are interacting with the world around them in sort of positive ways, but also thinking about how we're not just managing ecosystems, but how ecosystem management is part of the broader sort of set of things that people do. So Shackleton and their co-authors suggest that there's going to be particular outcomes that help us to improve managing invasive alien species. Um, Part of that, I think, is building those collaborations with different groups, and the Invasive Species Council, I think, has been doing an excellent job of that. We think about, the numbers of people they're able to get out today. That I think that speaks quite well about this sort of network of people involved and concerned about invasive species. How do we take that and sort of leverage all this interest to getting some of these better outcomes? Is that getting people in their communities talking with their neighbors, sort of that informal um, collaboration, that sort of informal social learning, if you like. And what are some of the campaigns we might want to use that are a bit more formal, to really help people understand different pieces of information? Certainly, all of this comes into sort of contributing to and starting to understand sort of a social license for eradicating invasive species. We really do need that public support for management, not just in terms of individuals' behaviors, but support for those management actions as well. As I mentioned earlier, sometimes it becomes a bit of a trade-off. If we want to have these positive outcomes, we need to perhaps do less of something else that we really might enjoy doing. How do we support people making those trade-offs? Is it just delivery of knowledge, of information and ideas, or are there other things that we can be doing to understand these things, to understand these connections, understand these roles? So this is another picture from the council's website. This is the Prussian carp, and I had the opportunity a number of years ago to work with Stephanie Green and one of her graduate students on understanding the spread of Prussian carp throughout Alberta, and I guess Saskatchewan as well, because there are places where that's happening too, and just the connections of Prussian carp to agriculture and irrigation systems was quite new to me, but it helped to underpin these notions that some of these vectors for invasive species aren't always obvious. Um, and when we begin to understand them, it can be really complex to try to address those things. What are the socio and economic benefits and costs of invasive species? Well, we've talked about trade-offs already. It might start to create conflicts between different user groups, conflicts between different sort of land use types, and sometimes, if we're not careful, conflicts between neighbors or different parts of communities, in terms of the behaviors that they're doing that may promote invasive species management or things that might promote invasive species movement. Those are quite sort of opposed positions to have. We want to sort of, again, lower the heat on some of those, but try to understand and maybe leverage some of that passion to getting more positive outcomes. But I think we have to recognize that, people are going to communities will have a diversity of values, perceptions, and perspectives about things. How do we do that in this day and age where conversations between people close to us can be so challenging, trying to get through all the social media, for example? And it comes down, I think, partly to how we frame invasive species issues. How can we make it so that it grabs people's attention, but it's not perhaps too overwhelming that we just kind of throw up our hands and say, oh gosh, something else I have no control over. Because that can really affect the way that people feel and ultimately engage in the world around them. We want to try and, in a sense, try and be positive about that, but I think also be realistic. Understand the different motivations that people might have and try to craft messaging that sort of latches onto or connects with those particular motivations. I think ultimately we want to be thinking about how are people thinking and feeling about invasive species. But here we got to be careful. We can't think of it, or perhaps we shouldn't be thinking of it in terms of this big idea of invasive species, perhaps breaking it down to particular species in particular places, messaging for particular regions or communities, for example, instead of trying to get at every invasive species that we could possibly sort of address in Alberta, maybe if we break it down, we're able to frame things a bit more differently, not just differently for the particular species or context that we're concerned with, but with those particular communities and what they're feeling as well. Different different framings, different stories, different narratives might be really suitable for different kinds of contexts, but still have the same end in mind. Just really quickly, I won't get too nerdy about this, but we can bring particular social science theories to help understand how to influence people's behaviors. This is a theory of planned behavior. It was developed by Asian back in the 90s. It's still quite often used today. And what it really serves to look at is trying to understand people's behavior. This is ultimately what we'd want to affect. There's been a lot of work that suggests that the best predictor of behavior is someone's intention, an intention to act in a particular way, an intention to do something in a particular way. So a lot of work has been done to understand then, how do we influence people's intentions to do something? Certainly we have to understand their attitudes. And we're thinking here about the attitudes of the ultimate behavior. Is it a good behavior? Is it bad behavior? How can we make actions like draining your boat more socially acceptable, more socially desirable, something that we want to do to benefit our communities, to benefit our local areas. We need to think about subjective norms about these ideas too. Again, these are sort of these community or group norms or group attitudes. What do people around us think about maybe draining boats? Is it a good thing? Oh, don't worry about it. It's never been a problem for me. Again, we get influenced by the people around us. So some of our messaging might try to focus on how can we influence just the general attitudes of communities about things like invasive species. I think we also need to think about how much control do we have over the desired particular behaviors as individuals? Were we actually able to do those things? If it's something like draining a boat, for example, that seems to be something that we would have some control over, something that we should be able to accomplish. Certainly well within we're able to operate a boat. Draining a boat doesn't seem that much of a stretch. So we have control over these ultimate behaviors. How do we start to change communities' norms as well as people's attitudes about the benefits of draining boats? So this theory can provide us with some good approaches for doing that. But I think we also have to recognize that these behaviors are going to be really context or situation specific. So to a degree, we are able to look to see, oh, what's been done in other jurisdictions? What's been done with other species? What's been done in similar contexts? And get some learnings there. But we have to remember when we think about things like different ecosystems, different jurisdictions with different regulatory frameworks, context does matter. And the people within those systems might be different as well. So there's certainly learnings that we could have, but there's going to be sort of site-specific or context-specific information that we're going to have to gather. So just thinking, just sort of wrapping up here in terms of how we might incorporate human dimensions work, whether that's research, communication, better planning and management, lots of ways that we can do that. But I think ultimately it comes down to, in a sense, generating new knowledge. What are people in my community thinking about this particular issue? And then what can we do to engage with that? And so often I will get involved in that information finding, if you like. And we do that through a variety of different approaches. You've heard of many of these before. We do interviews and focus groups and workshops, group meetings, surveys, lots of different ways to gather information about these things. And that's kind of the social science, that's the data gathering, because we're not just sort of pulling things out of thin air. We do want evidence too, just like natural scientists as well. But I think we have to be careful not to expect definitive answers from social science. And that's not a great outcome, but I think it's realistic. Social science is a process. It's this process of understanding these particular systems. And this takes a bit of time. It is that process. And there's certainly learnings along the way that can help us in perhaps adaptive management kinds of contexts, make changes based on what we've learned. But we always need to be monitoring to understand, are we having the desired effects on this system? Are things sort of rolling out as we think they should? And I guess like any sort of data collection endeavor or communication endeavor, we have to be cautious not to make the means the ends. often I get involved with different groups, and we're developing a survey to understand particular populations and their engagements with particular ecosystems. And it becomes about, oh, we're going to do the survey. What's the survey up to? The survey is just a means of making observations, of gathering evidence. Once you have that data, once you have that evidence, then I would argue kind of the real work begins. What do we do with that information that we've gathered? What have we learned that'll help us influence perspectives and ultimately influence behaviors? Let's not lose sight of what it is we're seeking to do and getting wrapped up in just that data collection. And I think also just recognizing the size of the problems. We have to be kind of honest with ourselves about the challenges that we're facing. Sometimes we are able to break those down to more manageable chunks. Other times we can't. And I think just understanding and accepting, gosh, you know what, this is going to be a big and complex issue. It's going to take us a lot of time to solve or address. It kind of prepares us a bit better to perhaps approach those challenges in a more effective way. We have to be careful too, not to always reach for that same solution. A communication effort that went really well in one particular context, that's fantastic. But it might not work if we change the species or change the human sort of population that we're looking to influence. So we do need to consider a range of different interventions or approaches and make sure that they are really going to address that particular context that's in front of us. I think sometimes we get the ideas that the situations we're in are so unique. They're kind of, no one's ever come across these kinds of things before. And certainly we have to find that balance between understanding our own particular context and the people in it, the species that are in it, the habitats that are involved. And that might make particular things unique, but there's still things that we can learn. It's trying to find that balance of what can we draw in learnings from other places, other successes, understanding what also hasn't worked, but also thinking what is it about this particular group of people, this particular invasive species, for example, that we really need to know about and change, and sort of in that sense, kind of be empathetic to the experiences that others have had. I think sometimes too we get focused on things that stop us from succeeding, these sort of constraints or the barriers we might encounter. And I get that. I get overwhelmed as well. But I think more important is to focus on things like facilitators. What are things that have worked before? What are ways or people or groups that we can work with that might be able to support the outcomes that we're looking for? But sometimes it's a key person, sometimes it's a really good partnership. But we really do need to be thinking a bit more sort of positively, and I'd argue proactively as well, in terms of how we're going to be managing invasive species. And I will say too, at this point, I do understand that the Invasive Species Council has been quite active and has had a number of different campaigns. Um, and I think it's been quite incredible with the outcomes and the degree of interaction they've been able to achieve. And it seems to me, to some degree, they've already been engaging with some of these pitfalls, and I think have been able to demonstrate success as well. So just some quick final thoughts. I'm sorry I ended up talking a bit longer than I thought, but just to kind of suggest that public attitudes and preferences, trying to understand those, trying to elicit those from people, that takes time. I think we understand that, but sometimes we lose sight of the fact that incorporating, um, you know, social science observations, social science learnings into planning and management action can take a good deal of time too. There's no quick fix, I'm afraid. But we are in this for the long haul, so maybe that helps us navigate these different timelines. We also need to understand that changing people's behaviors isn't easy. It's going to meet with some resistance, um, and it's going to require persistence and dedication to get those messages through. This idea of social license, public support for the kinds of management outcomes that would see, for example, the eradication of invasive species in particular places. It's really important to get that public buy-in. But we need to, I suggest, think about these as relationships. When we engage the public, we start to collect information about them, what they think about things, how they're behaving. They're providing us with information, and we might think of that as a conversation. What do we provide back? It does, I think, raise expectations. If people hear about a survey, for example, that's going to address invasive species in aquatic environments, they would kind of expect to see some outcomes. So we can't just sort of have these sort of light touches with people, get some information, go away. It requires, I would argue, sustained engagement. And that's resource intensive. But I think to get those ultimate sort of successful outcomes and applications, that's kind of required. I guess lastly, just be cautious. Public values and attitudes might not be what you expect. You might not have the degree of support that you thought you had about a particular issue, which will require more effort. Maybe you've stumbled across a particular group of people that thinks along the same lines you do, that there are ways that we can address this invasive species issue, and we're willing to do what it takes to do that. That can be unexpected as well. So just, I guess, be ready, be flexible, and be adaptive in the things that you do. I'll finish that off here. Here's my email address if you'd like to send me any questions or ideas. But I think we have some opportunities now for some questions and answers as well. So thank you very much. Appreciate your time. I'll stop sharing the screen now.
That was awesome, Howie. Thank you so much. Really appreciate that. It was great.
Oh, thank you.
If everybody could put in any questions they have in the Q&A box there, we can get started. I did see one right off the hop here from Sherry. Do all relative human disturbances have unintended consequences? And your comment about a land-based approach and potential influences of these invasive species like Shackleton et al., where there are evidence-based approaches to be engaged in. Also, the perceptions of how we can mitigate these invasive, and whether there are nature-based solutions. Example, whirling disease in our salmonid species, trout, and other fish in Alberta.
Gosh, Sherry, that's a lot. I'll see what I can do, but really appreciate you asking that. I would say that all human disturbances have unintended consequences. I mean, maybe that's philosophy. But I think generally a lot of the planners and managers that we have, both in government and in NGOs working on these issues, do have some pretty good ideas about desired outcomes and how to get there. I think the ecology around invasive species, I think, is pretty substantial, fairly well established. It's the people side that we need to be thinking a bit more about. And I would say that unless people are doing things sort of deliberately in terms of actions, we might have unintended sort of outcomes in our behaviors. So how do we try to reduce those unintended consequences? Part of that might be information delivery, but that becomes a real challenge today because we're all being bombarded with information all the time. How do we find those particular channels? And maybe sometimes it's going back to things that aren't technology based. Talking with neighbors, talking with others. That's the whole communications thing. Evidence-based approaches, though, I think can be something that we should be striving for. We can gather evidence in terms of what people are doing, what people are thinking, sometimes what people are feeling about things. And we can use that information to craft our messaging and to help change particular behaviors that might be really problematic. So I think there's lots of work still to be done, but I think that it's sort of not all lost. We have really good guidance about how to do these things, but I think it comes down to putting in the same degree of effort we made on sort of the ecological understanding of invasive species, putting a similar effort into understanding people's interactions there too.
Perfect. That was a long question there, but that's a-okay. I saw one in the chat too from Callum. Do you have a specific example of a successful partnership with communities, industries, or policymakers that has enhanced invasive species control efforts using this holistic integrated approach?
I'm afraid I don't, Callum. I apologize for that. But there are some things out there, and sorry, I've been trying to bone up on invasive species science a bit, but I wasn't as far along as I was hoping to be for this talk. But I mean, there definitely are. You think about some of the things that the Alberta Invasive Species Council is doing, and I think that's where you start. You start with having actions in terms of, promoting people cleaning their boats, for example, and having those stations along the highways. Those can be effective. There's lots of other things around sort of wild boar, for example. A lot of this will be kind of adaptive management approaches where we will try things, monitor those outcomes, and make adjustments based on what's working or isn't. So I think we have a lot of those sort of frameworks and approaches ready. It's just being really careful in terms of how we craft those questions we have about people's interactions, and so that we're able to actually collect information and address those questions in a sort of robust kind of a way.
Perfect. I love how you're just boosting our egos over here at the ASC. It's great. Got another one from Ryan in the Q&A. Thanks so much for your presentation. There has been a common assumption that education will change people's behaviors, but that doesn't seem to normally be that straightforward. How much does trust play a role in convincing people to change their behaviors?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head, Ryan. I mean, like we were just saying, there's so much information coming at us. How do we make our signal stronger and appealing? Um, and I think a lot of it does come down to trust. We know that there's been a real drop in trust for particular public institutions. That's been, people have been studying that for several decades now, and it's been a fairly persistent decline. Um, that creates some additional challenges in terms of those communication pieces. Um, but I think trust is really important. And in my mind, trust really comes through those social interactions, those discussions we have with other individuals, sharing our experiences, and really trying to get a sense of where the other people are coming from. So trust is going to be a huge issue for sure. This could be trust of organizations and institutions. It can be trust of our neighbors and other people doing similar activities like angling, for example. I think generally social science, I think these days, no matter what the natural resource issue is concerned with trying to sort of find that correct balance between, trying to have enough trust, trying to get our messages out, but also trying to provide opportunities for people to be able to maybe experience some of these things themselves so they have that sort of direct knowledge. Um, Now, I don't want to put too fine a point on it, but by strengthening people's connections to natural areas, I think that can really help make them more relevant in terms of people's day to day, in terms of things that they do care about. That's a long continued effort that's needed to change those minds. I think that's uh, one of those sort of big take homes is that this won't happen overnight. These are going to be sort of long or mostly long interactions with folks and and a willingness, and maybe this feeds into trust as well, to be listening to other perspectives and ideas, and not just focusing too much on our own.
Oh, definitely. We have another one from, I'm sorry, I might butcher this, but Arniak. Thank you for your presentation. Your point about engagement raising expectations. I wonder if you have some thoughts about communicating how governments cannot tackle all invasives and the need to prioritize, but at the same time having empathy for their sometimes saddening and overwhelming invasive infestations. I feel like sometimes increased awareness and engagement causes a loss in trust.
Yeah, it's a pretty complex space, and I know that I may be frustrating many of you on the call today just with my generalities. Because I think so often, and I think that much of the literature supports this, the context matters so much. What's the particular issue that you're facing? How is that affecting people, their livelihoods, their well-being? Is it affecting some people more than others? How's that affecting our landscapes? And what are some of those longer term implications, perhaps, for ecosystem function, as well as those ecosystem services that we want to benefit from? Um, I think government does serve a pretty important role to coordinate management, to kind of perhaps lead us to places that we might not be ready to go to. But I think we need to not completely rely on government. I think we have to be contributing these issues ourselves. And I think we have to find those people in those different communities that care about these things too. It's amazing to me that so many people have come up on a Tuesday afternoon to listen to this. I'd say to you folks on the call, you have a role to play, and you might be in a well position to mobilize people in your own community, not necessarily to mobilize action, that would be great, but just sort of mobilize information and ideas about the particular invasive species issues in your area. What can you be doing differently? What can you perhaps demonstrate to others that you have done differently that's having a positive outcome? Um, I think those are important, but I'm not naive enough to think we don't always have to. We also need to mobilize a lot of people to see these big effects, these effects of change on our landscapes and in our water bodies. Um, I think it requires attention, and I think opportunities like this, groups like the Alberta Invasive Species Council, are elevating these ideas. I think it's continuing to do these things, and maybe as we're having some success adding on additional commitments, perhaps. Okay, we've done this well. What have we learned? Where can we take that next? So it is certainly a process. And I would say the best thing we can do to address trust is getting people to talk to each other.
Nice. Yeah, it's always keep moving. I feel like there's never an end, but it's good. Good job, security, right? Um, Marlene says, in your view, what is the role of culture in the human dimensions of invasive species management? Much of what you said seems to be largely based on Western science, social science perspectives. What do other cultures relate to invasive species?
That's a great question, Marlene. And absolutely, that's the perspective I've adopted as a sort of a Western sort of scientific approach. Um, I also understand that some of the sort of invasive species issues we're seeing are because of different sort of cultural ideas and perceptions and behaviors about things that, about ways of being that are different from say the Western perspective. I think one of the great things about Canada is that it's not a melting pot, that we have opportunities for different cultures to persist and interact in sort of traditional ways. But that can pose problems. I I do not think that the Western science perspective is the only way that we can address these. I think there's lots to be learned from um, Indigenous science. There's lots to be learned from other cultures, histories, and perspectives as well. But it's bringing those people together to think about how do we address this particular issue in front of us. And I think that specificity of saying, okay, well, what's this one issue that we want to tackle? That helps to focus things. And I think through that focusing, we get those conversations that might help to establish or elevate trust. But I think we have to be open to hearing different ideas, what's worked in different areas. But we have to be cautious too, because we have particular regulatory frameworks, particular ecosystems that respond in particular ways to invasive species. We kind of have to deal with in front of us, but not lose sight of that big picture. It's a tricky space to be in, but yeah, and I apologize again for being so general. But we have to start somewhere.
Took the words right out of my mouth. We have just a couple comments here. Great perspective. Thanks for the presentation. This one isn't necessarily a question, but I'll just say that education outreach component while working as an invasive species manager in government has been challenging since we are very limited with respect to our communications options, Facebook only usually. So partner organizations seem to have more flexibility with getting creative. So kudos to the ASC for all their progress and success. Thank you. Additionally, it seems like some of the options that have the potential to make a big difference are often the most time resource intensive. So like activities in the classroom and whatnot. We also have, thanks Howie, it seems that the risk aversion or fear from invasive gets strongly diluted once these species gain some kind of material value or become part of a culture or a system like a market. For example, we see species like wild boar become deeply entrenched into the culture and economy in parts of the US where eradication becomes a trope that few people actually believe. there is a perverse incentive to actually keep them on the landscape now. I see this creep happening the Prussian carp as people are starting to develop an angling community for these fish. There are many other examples, snakeheads, East States, Zander in the UK. It seems the challenge is to change attitudes well before these species become part of subcultures imbued with value. That seems to be a huge challenge.
I totally agree, Brian.
Yeah.
It's a tough one for sure. On one hand, that's really the adaptability of people, isn't it? We can, oh, Prussian carp, maybe it's not bad eating after all. But and I think I guess in parts of Europe that might be the case, and maybe some of those stories, some of those recipes get brought over here. Um, but we again need to be really focused on, okay, what are our ecosystems and what can they support? It's not that we don't want to say don't eat Prussian carp. It's well, I think it's more basic than that. Prussian carp are pose real ecological challenges for many of the other things that we really depend on. Um, but you're right. What's the early warning system? I'm not sure I know the answer to that one.
All right. If anybody has any more questions, I would toss them quickly into the chat here. We've got a bunch of great comments in the chat about the presentation. It was fantastic, very interesting, and I'll thank Hannah and Nicole as well for coming on. Hannah, did you have any last words? I see you popping on.
I was gonna ask Howie a question, but I couldn't figure out how to type it in. I think I can only read the Q&A. I can't make a queue.
Oh.
But I was just interested if he could give us an example of a project he's been involved in where human dimensions were kind of brought on board and considered as part of the project, and that what kind of they were able to bring to the project, and sort of maybe like a motivational example of sort of how they can really make a difference in something that he's been involved in.
Oh, thanks, Hannah. So a lot of the work I've been doing for the past sort of 15 years or so has been for the North American Waterfowl Management Plan. NAWAP for short. It's a mouthful. And what this is an agreement between Canada, the US, and Mexico to manage waterfowl species and their habitats. And Canada plays a really important role there because we're the duck factory in a sense. The prairie provinces and the potholes are fantastic habitat for waterfowl. But the constituency for waterfowl has been declining. The number of waterfowl hunters in North America has declined from the 1970s. I don't know, it's at least two-thirds less of what it used to be. All that to say, with that sort of loss of the hunter constituency or the numbers of, how do we maintain the relevancy of waterfowl and wetlands in the public mind? So we've been working with the public of Canada trying to understand, what do Canadians think, feel, and do about waterfowl and wetlands. And we're able to engage in some, I guess, sort of basic research. What do Canadians think about wetland environments? How important are they? We were able to sort of seed a little bit of information about ecosystem services. How do people think about those things? So we've been able to kind of get a sense of sort of different typologies or different sort of clusters of sort of thought types or attitude types about what different groups of Canadians are thinking about waterfowl, bird habitats, like perhaps more generally. And we are able to note what those differences are. So in terms of trying to create messaging, we have some, I guess, better information about the kinds of messages these different kind of groups would kind of twig to. The sort of the outcome of those messages is the same, but how we craft those messages will be different so that they resonate a little bit more. I guess another thing that we found was we asked people to sort of help. What do we try to do here? Well, we tried to get a sense of sort of the economic value of bird habitats for Canadians. which is kind of a tricky thing to do because we often don't think of bird habitats all that often, and when we do, it's kind of fairly abstract. Um, but there does seem to be a good deal of support among Canadians to conserve bird habitat. Now, even calling it bird habitat is framing it in a particular way, but it does seem to be one that resonates with people and something that, there is a good deal of support for. I'm hesitant to give you that number because it's a big number and it requires a lot of context to kind of to get. I don't want the big number to be the headline, but there is a good deal of support from some Canadians. There's other Canadians who don't feel that it's as important, and that's part of the picture too. That's part of our understanding. Um, so what do we do with this information? Well, we work with provincial, federal government agencies as well as NGOs in a coordinated way to help craft those messages to get them into various constituencies, as well as use that information in for planning and management. If we do find that there's a good deal of support for providing bird habitats for particular kinds of birds in Canada, that's that social license I was speaking of a little bit earlier. And that makes it somewhat easier for planners, managers, and, well, I guess ultimately politicians to understand that, okay, this is where the public is wanting us to go. Um, we got to get there. So there are many different ways, and I think it's definitely that collaboration, working with folks like you to understand what are the particular management issues and what are the roles that people are playing in exacerbating these issues, so that we can then start to understand where people are coming from, so that ultimately we can try to change those behaviors into something that's a bit more congruent with the kinds of outcomes we're looking for.
Awesome. Well, I'm really hopeful that this has been awesome for everybody in attendance. I loved it. I'm glad that we have it on recording in case I miss anything. I do want to go back still. But I think that that's all for the questions. I really appreciate you guys joining us for the webinar here, and thank you guys for speaking. Just want to remind everybody that's left over, we do have the forum recorded, so it'll be posted to the council's YouTube channel, as well as our news and events webpage. And then there'll be a follow-up survey to help us gather evidence. So like how we mentioned, by completing this survey, we'll be able to follow up and actually work with it and continue to gather information from there. But yeah, just thanks for joining us and hope you guys all have a good little lunch there. We'll talk to you soon. Take care.
Thanks, everybody.